So we have been taking time over this month to look at the ultimate love story. And it's not a Hollywood creation. It's not even a Hallmark Channel deal, although, you know, they seem to own the market on love stories. But it's this greatest of all love stories. It's the story of God and his love for you and for me. And so we've been taking time to look at God and what he has done and how he has moved and what he has done to show his love to us, and that we were actually made to love. That's what we've been looking at, and how God made us to love him back and also to receive his love, to really grow in this love. And to see that, we've been making our way through this prayer that Paul, this leader in the early church, wrote, and he actually prayed over the Christians in the church of Ephesus, and I think it's a prayer that he also prayed for all of us, okay? And so we've been making our way through this prayer. It's found in the middle of this letter we call Ephesians, and really the whole letter revolves around this, but I want us to just kind of launch from here again. And so here we are, Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 14. So when I think of all of this, Paul writes, when I think of everything that God has done to bring us back to himself, this massive, crazy love, I fall to my knees and I pray to the Father, the creator of everything in heaven and on earth, and I pray that from all of his glorious unlimited resources, that he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit, because then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him, and your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have power to understand, as all God's people should, just how wide and how long and how high and how deep his love really is. And may you experience the love of Christ, though it's just too great to understand fully. But then you'll be made complete with all the fullness and life and power that comes from God. Okay, so now over the last several weeks, we've been opening this up, beginning with the last part, verses 18 and 19, as we talked about how we need to see God's love, that we need to grasp it and really be grasped by it, how we need to do more than that, that we need to experience God's love, right? It's this thing that it's greater than the amount of knowledge that we have. We have to step into this. It's something we need to experience. Today we're shifting just one verse back from those to verse 17 as we look at what it means to really grow in God's love, okay? And Paul gives us a visual image here. He actually gives us a couple in this letter, but the first is this, of this tree with roots that are sinking deep into the earth. That's the image of growth that he gives us. And I don't know, maybe you've experienced this. I know that I tend to like plants. I kind of grew up with plants in the house and some other things like that, but there's a deal when it comes to trees and really plants of any kind. What they're rooted in impacts their growth potential. What they're rooted in impacts their growth potential. Maybe let me give you a picture that will help us understand this idea. So years ago, when I was back in school, when I was a wee little lad, right, there was a particular holiday that I absolutely loved and looked forward to called Arbor Day. Anybody fans of Arbor Day out there? Okay. Now, I'm serious, right? Because back in the day, and I know I sound really old when I say that. I'm really not that old. But back in the day, on Arbor Day at school, you were given a particular gift. You remember this? Some of you were with me, right? You were given a tree. You were given a tree, right? I don't think they do that anymore. It's such a loss of culture and society and goodness, right? You were given this tree on Arbor Day. And so this particular year, I was given a pine tree. I had one, and my mom, who was teaching at the time, was given an extra one. She had an extra one, so she brought it home. And so we had these two baby pine trees. They were only about, yay big. And we decided we were going to plant them right outside the big picture window of the house that we lived in. And so you know how this goes, right? So you plant them, and then for the first several weeks, you're out there and you're watering them, making sure that they're kind of acclimating to this new environment. So we did this. And no matter what I would do, though, no matter how much care I poured into these two little pine trees, they just struggled to grow. Now, we knew part of the problem. Part of the problem was this. My older sister was cutting grass one day. We never had a problem with grass growing in the yard. That always seemed to just shoot up all the time, right? But as she was cutting the grass, it was rather tall. As she was cutting the grass, she accidentally mowed over the pine trees, okay? And so, in case you didn't know this, when you mow over trees, it tends to block their growth potential. Okay, that's just a life lesson in case you didn't know. Mowing down trees inhibits their growth. Okay, but I nursed these things back to health. I'm pouring Miracle-Gro on them and watering them with the watering can, all of this stuff, right? And we nurse them back, and they start to grow. Okay, but after even a couple of years, in fact, after several years, they only grew at most about just a couple of feet out of the dirt. They were healthy little trees, right? But they never grew beyond just a couple of feet. So after I graduated college, Mom and Dad decided they were gonna, well, it's supposed to be downsized. They actually got a larger house. I'm not sure how that works, right? But they moved to another part of town, and they said, well, you know what? We really want to take these 2 baby pine trees with us. And they have this, their backyard is like this beautiful garden that they've put together. They had a couple of perfect spots that they wanted these pine trees to go in. And so they planted these pine trees. They transplanted them to their new place. And I got to tell you, in just a few months, they started to notice incredible growth. And in just a few years, those trees began to tower over everything else in their yard. Here's just a picture of one of them. And the other one was a faraway shot. I didn't put it up on the screen, right? But it's incredible the change that took place in the life of these 2 pine trees. And here's the difference. Back in the house that I grew up in, the topsoil was good, but if you went down about a foot or 2 feet, what you ran into was this really hard clay, right? It's similar to here, right? And so the ground was great at top, but the roots couldn't penetrate that clay. But my parents' new home, man, the soil was rich and it was fertile and it was no clay in sight. And those roots had the freedom to just go down deep. And that tree was able to grow and reach its full potential. What they were rooted in impacted their growth potential. And honestly, I think that's part of the truth that Paul wants to share with us in this prayer and in this letter that we call Ephesians, that what you and I are rooted in impacts our growth potential. Okay, now here's the deal. Sometimes our lives reflect those pine trees. Sometimes we fail to really grow in this life in Jesus because, well, you know what? We get mowed over. And sometimes it's mowed over by circumstances. Sometimes you get mowed over by people. Sometimes it's faced with those circumstances. We just struggle, though, to just grow, right? Because we've been mowed down. But more often than not, it's not so much about external forces that are like cutting us down. More often it's what we choose to root our lives in. What we choose to let source our lives, right? Because what we're rooted in impacts our growth potential. So in this world, there are so many things that are calling for our attention, and we've talked about this before, so many things that want to be that source in our lives, or that we're told need to be that source in our lives. And so sometimes, it's all about the money, right? And so it's the accumulation of money and stuff, and that becomes the source in my life. And so we sink our roots down into long hours at work. We go in early, we come home late, we're working harder than everyone else because we want to earn that money. Or maybe we wrap our roots or our lives around our net worth, and our value comes from that, all in what we have. Or maybe it's always reaching for what we don't yet have, right? But it's this idea of money as kind of the source that we're trying to wrap our roots around. Sometimes other people put their roots into relationships, and again, we've talked about this. They wrap their lives around this other person. They're sinking their roots down into that. And so they're looking to this friend, or maybe it's a child that you've had, or a grandchild, or maybe it's this romantic pursuit. And somehow I just believe that this person is going to complete me. This person's going to make me whole. And so I'm going to wrap my lives, and I'm going to make that person the source of my life. For others, it's sometimes it's a popular one in our culture today. It's our feelings. Again, it's not that feelings are bad. Feelings just kind of are what they are. God created us as emotional beings, right? They're just here up one time and maybe down the next. But we live in a day and age where culture tells us that we need to elevate our feelings really above all else, especially when it comes to the decisions we make. We need to sink our roots down into our feelings and let them be the driving source. And so you hear things like, do what feels good, right? Or follow your heart. Or I saw another one in the story the other day, do what makes you smile, right? And it's not that those things are necessarily bad, but maybe it's not a good source. Maybe it's not so much your feelings or money or relationships, but it's dreams, or it's some plan or goal that you've set for yourself. And so you let this plan, this goal, this this deal source your life and drive you forward as you try to pursue this dream of what you want to be or what you want to have or whatever you set as the measure for success. Maybe it's something else entirely that you've either put your roots in or you've seen other people put their roots down into to source their lives. Right? And again, it's not that these things are evil on their own. It's not that they're bad. Right? It's good to earn money. It's good to have friends. Feelings are good. But God never intended these to be the source of your life and mine. Because that soil tends to block your growth potential. You tracking with me? And so here's the truth I hope you're beginning to see as we kind of open this up, that unlike a tree or a plant or something like that, you and I, we get to choose what we're going to sink our roots into in this life. We get to choose what we're going to let source our lives. Okay? And if you feel like you're not really growing today, if you're like, you know what, spiritually I just kind of feel like I'm stagnant, I've plateaued, or maybe I'm kind of slipping back, I just don't feel, Kirk, like I'm growing in Jesus like I need to. Well, maybe it's because you've been mowed down. Okay, and if that's the case, as a church, we want to pray with you. We want to come alongside of you and let Jesus bring healing into your life. That's really one of the purposes of why we're launching Living Free. And you could sign up today to be a part of that first group that's going to start in March. But that's one of the reasons we want to do that, is to help people who've maybe been mowed down receive the healing and wholeness that God has given to you. But maybe the reason you're not growing isn't because of that. It's because you've chosen poor soil to source your life. Because what we're rooted in impacts our growth potential. Okay? And so this is what Paul gets at and why he prayed for those Christians and us as well. I pray that out of his glorious riches, out of God's glorious unlimited resources, that he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit, and then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him, and your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. God doesn't want your life, your spiritual growth, to be stunted in any way. He wants you and he wants me to reach our full potential that he's destined for us to step into. He wants us all to grow up and to grow strong, right? In fact, why don't you just bless your neighbor today and tell him, God wants you to grow up. God wants you to grow up, right? Now, some of you, I have to admit that you didn't say that in love, right? And that's a big part of what we're talking about today, okay? It's a huge part of what God has for us. And so really, here's the larger point, if I could just bottle this for you today. God longs for us to grow in his love. That's what God wants for you and for me, to let his love be what sources our lives, to let his love be what we wrap ourselves around, to sink our roots deep down into it and let it sink its roots deep down into us, okay? And God longs for us to grow in his love because what we're rooted in impacts our growth potential, and to really reach your fullest potential in Jesus, to live a life that best reflects his, right, we need to be growing in his love. You with me? Okay, so now the question is, what does that really look like, and how do we kind of live this out? And that's where Paul just kind of focuses on several parts in this letter we call Ephesians. In fact, you can really kind of make a study out of that, about how we grow in God's love. There's one place that's right before this prayer, and there are several that take up the latter part of this letter, but we're going to jump to the one right before, back up to chapter 2, and let me just kind of kick you over to verse 19. That's where we're going to start here. So consequently, because of what God has done, again, in bringing us to him, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but you are fellow citizens with God's people and also members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. And in him the whole building is joined together, and it rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Okay, and so Paul shifts the imagery just a little bit. He's still talking about growing in love, but instead of a tree with roots, and he's still kind of playing with that in the midst of all this, but at the same time, he's also dabbling with a different image of a building with this incredible foundation, right? This cornerstone, right? And here's really the first truth Paul gives us, that growing in God's love means being rooted in one true foundation. We call him Jesus, our true foundation. Now, let me help you see this a little bit better, because we have maybe a different idea of what a cornerstone is today in our culture than what Paul's talking about back then. For us, a cornerstone in a building is often like a time capsule. We were going to do this in the parsonage. We found one of the pillar tops came off, and we looked down, and it was completely empty. And we thought, well, how fun would it be to just pack some stuff down in there and just mess with the neighbors who would, eventually buy the house from us. We didn't do it, okay? But that's kind of what we do with buildings today. We have a cornerstone, and you put stuff in there, and then later on you break it open like 100 years later, and you can see what life was like a while ago. It's like a time capsule. Sometimes that stone, maybe it's a little bit larger than the rest of the stones, and on it is put the name of the building, the name of the church. Maybe you see that around town a lot, or the date that it was built or erected, you can see that. Sometimes when we hear that word cornerstone, we think of like a capstone. This whole building is built and it rises to the top, and then there's this one piece that's put on top, and we kind of sometimes think of that as the cornerstone. The truth is, none of those images is what Paul has in mind here. None of that is what he's looking at. None of that's what he's talking about. You see, back when Paul was writing this, the cornerstone, it was essential to the building. It's not something that's just kind of fluffed. It's a time capsule. It's not something that goes on top. It's actually this foundational deal. And they were these massive stones that were quarried. Now, when I say massive, I mean massive. I'm talking hundreds of tons, especially if you're going to set out to build something like a temple, okay? And so you've got this thing. In fact, a few have been uncovered from archaeologists in ancient Israel of where different places like a temple structure would have been built. And those cornerstones in the time of Jesus weighed over 500 tons. 500 tons. Now, just to help you understand what that looks like, that's like 300 cars. That's like 4 blue whales. I know you all look like, you know what blue whales look like and how big they are, right? About 4 of those. It's about 6 space shuttles. That's how much it weighs. 6 space shuttles. It's this incredibly massive stone that is set as this anchor for this building. And every other part of the building is attached to this thing, and every other part of the building now draws its strength and security and stability from this massive cornerstone that is placed as the foundation, right? And they need that massive strength because of the instability of the area. In case you don't know, Israel's prone to a lot of earthquakes. Not many that are major, but a whole lot of little earthquakes go on all the time. And so when you build something, you really want it to last, don't you? You really want something that's going to endure whatever life throws at it. And so what you want is this massive cornerstone that's going to be this secure foundation, right? This anchor. Now hold on to that thought. Because at the same time, these stones they were cut and laid with expert precision. So these things are level. I mean level. And they're perfectly straight. Maybe they didn't have our modern tools, but when we hold our stuff up to it, we're like, this is incredibly crazy how good this is, right? Because the cornerstone, you see, it sets the standard for the rest of the building. All of the walls are going to be based off of this stone. And so if this cornerstone isn't perfect, if it isn't right, if it isn't true, if it isn't plumb, then the walls that are going to branch off are never going to meet like they're supposed to. And the roof that's going to attach to the house is never going to line up with the walls the way that it's supposed to. And the whole structure is going to be weakened if that cornerstone is not right and straight and true. You tracking with me? So you're starting to see why it's important to have a cornerstone in your life? Because in this world, life is so unstable. None of us knows what's going to happen 5 minutes from now, 5 hours from now, 5 days from now, 5 years from now. In one moment, everything seems fine and stable, but in the next, everything can just kind of be shaken and unsteady. And in those moments, your choice of a cornerstone in your life, man, it determines how you're going to stand. Foundations matter. Because if Jesus is your cornerstone, and if you're sinking your roots deep down into Him and you're just wrapping yourself around Him and His love for you, then no matter what happens in life, you know this truth. He is holding on to you. Okay? That He has a way to take what is meant for your destruction by the enemy of your souls, and He's going to step into this and He's going to turn it, and it's going to be something that grows your faith in Him. It's going to be something that glorifies Him in your life so that other people see you and see the reality of God in your life, and they're now drawn to Jesus because of what He's doing in your life. When He's your anchor, He says, I promise to lead you through this. It might be crazy, it might be unstable, everything might be shaking, but hold on to me, and I'm going to lead you through. But He's not just a massive anchor. He's the one who is right and straight and true. I love the song that we sing that He's our good, good Father, right? And one of the lines is, you are perfect in all of your ways to us. He always moves to bring what is good and right and best into our lives because He's driven by His massive love for you and for me. And when we live our lives lining up with Him, that's key. When we live our lives lining up with Him, when we let Him shape our lives to match His so that we begin to take on the very character and nature of Jesus, right? We know that when we live open to God this way, that allows Him to bring His best into our lives. Okay, and so in this world, there are all kinds of things, so many places, so many people that we could live and try to anchor ourselves to. So many things that we could use as a foundation. We need to remember in those moments that what we're rooted in impacts our growth. And why would we ever choose anything but Jesus? He's the one who has proven His love 1,000 times over. And He proved it again 1,000 times more. And so to really grow in love begins here as we sink our roots deep down in Jesus. Just do all you can to wrap your life around Him. So that means getting into His Word and reading about Him and His way of living and His plan for your life. That means praying to Him, choosing Him as the cornerstone and foundation of your life. Let Him and His love source our lives. This is how we begin growing up in His love. Okay? We need Jesus as our cornerstone, as our foundation. But we also need more than that. Okay? Now let me explain what I mean. Because to really grow in God's love, He intends us to actually have more than just Jesus as that foundation. We need each other. We need each other. Here's how Paul puts it. Now drop back with me again to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. So now you Gentiles, that'd be us, are no longer strangers and foreigners, because before we've been excluded from worshiping God. Right? You are now citizens along with all of God's holy people. You are members of God's family. Say that word family with me. Family. You are now members of God's family. And this is really the second truth that Paul gives us in how we grow in love. Growing in love means being rooted in our new family, and we call it the church. Okay? Being rooted in our new family. Now, here's why part of that is important. Not all of it, but this is just part of why this is important. So the group that Paul is writing to, this Ephesians church, right? They were really wrestling. They were coming out of a very, I think we could call it a divisive culture. A divisive culture. They were divided along lines of race, right? You've got the Jews and you've got Gentiles. You've got it even more than that, okay? But that's kind of a basic breakdown there. They were divided by economic status. You had those who had and those who had not, right? And kind of see that before. They were divided by religion. They were divided by politics. They were divided by a whole host of issues. In fact, it's so bad that Paul describes this division in chapter 2 of Ephesians as this dividing wall of hostility. Okay? It's hatred. It's separation. It's opposition. You're over there and I'm over here and we don't like you. That was their culture. Does it sound familiar? It should. Right? It's easy for us today in our divisive culture to allow it to impact and really infect us personally because this is the culture in which we live. Right? And it's hard to not let some of that rub off. We deal with this kind of hostile environment every day. It's why we shy away from talking about certain topics when we get together with family or around the water cooler. Or worse, it's why we start to evaluate everything in terms of, well, this is what I'm for and this is what I'm against. And we always have this kind of mindset in so many things that we go into. It is easy for that divisive culture to not just make its way into us, but to make its way into the church. So that instead of focusing on what we have in common, Jesus and this incredible life with him, our eyes are drawn to things that can divide. Now, when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about sin issues now, right? We should see a divide there, where we stand with Jesus, our cornerstone, right? We're lining up with him, letting God shape our lives off of the life of Jesus. Jesus alone, who defines and really divides what is right and true from what is wrong and unhealthy and sinful and toxic in our lives, right? That division we should see. And we should always line up with Jesus and stand with him time and time again, okay? That's what we need to be doing. But there are other areas in life that aren't sinful. But our divisive attitudes can become sin in us over things that aren't so important. It's easy for us to move like the world and begin complaining. It's easy for us to draw up sides about who and what I'm for and really who and what I'm against, even in the church, because that's life in this world. Okay, but listen, you and I, when we come to Jesus, we are not of this world anymore. We're in it, but we're not supposed to act like it and move with it. We're supposed to grow in love. You with me? And so to learn how to do that, God has given us a family to practice what it means to love as God loves. And while Paul actually talks about this more fully as you get into the latter half of this letter, as he talks about husbands and wives and children and family and really even the work environment and even more, right? He gives us kind of the framework at the beginning of chapter 4 and also just another spot later on in chapter 4. And so here's just the beginning of what he talks about. He says, "Now as a prisoner for the Lord, I urge you then to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love." I love that. Live a life worthy of the calling you've received. Now, when he's talking about calling in this sense, it's not so much about calling into a particular job or a career or maybe some ministry that you sense God leading you into. It's not that kind of calling, not right here, right? Instead, it's this calling all of us have received when we come to Jesus. It's the calling to step out of the patterns and practices of this world and into this new life with Jesus, where we are now growing in his love. It's life where we take on his patterns and his practices, okay? So that means it's life where we show humility, okay? Life isn't really all about me and what I want, not when I'm following Jesus. Because of God's love, I know that he is for me. And that means that I can now live for other people. I don't have to put myself first because I know God is putting me first in his life, okay? And so now I can find ways to actually help and encourage and lift up others around me so that they all embrace what God has for them. It's life where we can move in gentleness, which means that I don't respond and move from a position of power over somebody else, but instead I try to meet people where they are, and I respond in ways that seek to, let's just diffuse the tension and let's remove the barriers so that we can help one another grow in love, okay? It's life where we move with patience, which means not forcing others to move at our speed, but I'm going to throttle back and I'm going to choose to move at the speed of this other person. It's life where we bear with one another, where we put up with other people and their personality differences, where we just let the little things go and we give a whole lot of grace, right? Because the truth is, you and I, we need grace given to us because we're not the easiest person to live with either, okay? Don't say amen when you look at your neighbor right now. That would be a bad place to do that, okay? But it's also this. It's life lived where we show kindness and compassion, and we forgive people when we're hurt, and we seek to restore relationships that are broken whenever possible. This is the life that God has called us to live. This is the love he's called us to give. And that's part of why God has saved us, not so that we're all by ourselves living kind of this Lone Ranger kind of Christian existence, but he saved us into a family that we call the church to help us grow in what it means to live out this life of love. Okay? So we have this true foundation of Jesus. That's our source. We're wrapping our roots around that. We've got this family that we're wrapping ourselves around so we can practice what it means to grow in love. And Paul shows us one more way that God helps us to grow in giving us really the right focus of glorifying God. And so here's that last part of Ephesians chapter 2 that we were looking at. In him, in Jesus, in our cornerstone, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, in Jesus, you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. So that's the image here, right? It's not just any kind of building. What's being built here is this temple. It's this place that worships and exalts and glorifies and just points to God. This is our focus. This is our motivation. This is what needs to be driving us. That we belong to a God who loved us so much that he sent his son into the world to save us. And that Jesus, man, he didn't come kicking and screaming, but he willingly stepped out of heaven and he came on this greatest of all rescue missions, and he died and he rose again from the dead to rescue us from sin and shame and regret and our past and so much more. And that because of his love, man, we've been changed. And we've been brought into this incredibly new life that is built on his love, that is rooted in Jesus, so that we are now sourced by his love. And so now we can move to love other people. Okay, we begin in the church, and then we move outside of the church. And we're moving now to encourage, and we're moving to help, and we're moving to listen, and we're just going to be there for other people. And every time it's with this focus of, man, in this moment, God, I'm wanting to point people to you. I want to point people to you. And so when people ask you, man, you're just different. You always seem to have hope in your life. Or, man, why are you here for me right now? I don't really have a whole lot of other people that are hanging with me in this moment. You now have the opportunity, when those conversations open themselves up like that, to point to the one who is greater than you, the one who is growing you up in his life, as you just tell them, you know what, I am here because there's a God who loves me. And more than that, there's a God who loves you beyond all measure. And I would love to tell you about him. This is the life that God has called you to live. It's a life that is growing in his love. It's rooted in this true foundation, Jesus, the ultimate love example that we've ever been shown. And it's where we're growing by knowing him, right? Intentionally pursuing him, doing all we can to just get up close to him. He's the one we need sourcing our lives, not someone, not something else. It's life where we're rooted in this new family that God has brought us into. We call it the church, right? But we're getting to know one another, and we're going to practice what it means to live out love towards one another. It's rooted in having that right focus. This love that just points to God. And I'm going to try to point other people and connect them to you, Jesus, the one who loves me, and I know you love them. And can you begin to see now how life lived, growing in love, how that can change your family? Do you see that? How that could change your marriage, your relationship with your children, and so much more. If you chose to grow in love and you decided, you know what, I'm going to respond more in kindness and compassion. I'm going to model God's kind of forgiveness. Can you see how that would change your family? Can you see how it would change where you work? If you said, I know it's not about how other people are responding to me in this moment, but I'm going to reflect Jesus here where I work. I'm going to try to choose, regardless of how people respond to me, but I'm going to try to choose to respond in gentleness. I'm going to try to hold on to patience in the midst of the crazy of whatever's going on in your work environment. It's not about letting that rub off on me. I want Jesus to rub off on them. You with me? Can you see how it could change? Can you see how it would impact our church, our family here, as this place becomes more and more this place that just reflects God's love? And when people just come in here, they experience it. Right? It hits them in the face. Not literally. That would be painful. It hits them in the face, though, as they come in, and they're just overwhelmed by God's presence and his love because they see it coming out of you and me. man, we need to be growing in God's love. And so let's just personalize this today as we kind of bring this to a close. When you look at your life, are you growing in love? And I'm not asking if you're perfect in living this out. I'm asking if you're growing. Are you growing? And if you're not growing, or if you're saying, you know what, Kirk, I am, but maybe I'm kind of not as fast as God would want me to grow, then what is holding you back? What's holding you back? And maybe today you're like, you know, Kirk, when you were talking about a situation or circumstance or a person that's just kind of mowed you over, man, that's me. And I'm just trying to heal up from that. And again, we just want to be a church that comes alongside of you and prays with you and supports you and encourages you, because God has healing He wants to bring into your life. But maybe today, that's not your story. Maybe today you would admit that the reason you're not growing is because of what you are choosing to root your life in. Maybe it's seeking money or relationships, or maybe it's you're responding too much out of your feelings, or maybe it's all about being driven by this plan, this goal that you have. Maybe it's something else entirely, but you know that it's not Jesus that's sourcing your life. And today you just hear the voice of Jesus calling. I hope you do. I hope you do. To just set those things aside and turn to Him and really wrap your life around Him. To sink your roots down deep into Him. So what does that next step look like for you? How is God calling you to grow in His love? Growing in knowing Jesus, growing and showing love to other people. And how will you respond today and say yes to Him as you let Him grow you?